Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith. And as we get started today, I want to invite all of our listeners, please go and like us on Facebook, subscribe to us on SoundCloud or Podcast Republic or whatever podcast catcher you use. That helps us out a lot in getting our material out there and also just making the world a smarter place. That's part of our, it's one of the things we're trying to do. And if they can't even be, if we can't get to that point, well, hopefully we can at least help people think deeply. And so I know we have a tall task ahead of us, but anyway, you can help share our material, helps us out tremendously. All right, Dr. Smith, today our topic is going to be modern philosophy, and this is actually the new course that Dr. Smith is rolling out over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. If you want to take our courses, they're there for subscription, they're there for purchasing, and they're there to fill that educational gap between good, solid parish catechesis and kind of a 4-year degree if you were to go away to university should they ever open up again. And so we're really trying to fill that educational gap there. And another part that really makes, I think, Catholic Studies Academy unique is that we are doing not just theology, but theology alongside philosophy. The two wings with which we will fly and navigate this lost world.
That's right. That's right. It's Leo the 13th, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Or not right. Or it's what's the name of that one? I can't remember right off the top of my head, but it's good.
So Dr. Smith's new class is going to be modern philosophy. So we thought we'd throw this out there as kind of a good introduction and to not just his course, but also and this will be kind of maybe our kickoff point here, Dr. Smith, is the history of philosophy. It's good to know, the main ideas, the thoughts that have come out of philosophical thought and the broad tradition of it. But one of the things that, and I'll point out to our listeners, that Dr. Smith does is he goes back and forth between something like metaphysics to a historical time period. And so, Dr. Smith, to get us started, maybe you can explain to us what modern philosophy is and kind of how it falls into the history of philosophy, and maybe why is that historical perspective important for the learner, for us common folk.
Gotcha, Jason. So thanks for the question. I love teaching the history of philosophy courses. So far in CSA, I've done ancient philosophy and medieval philosophy. Now we're moving on to modern philosophy. This should be very interesting to our regular students who are part of the academy, but also to anyone else, because this is really our intellectual backyard, right?
Yeah.
You want to kind of think about, like, where does our culture come from? Where do our dominant ideas come from? They come from this period that we're going to be studying, which is roughly 1600 to 1900. Yeah. It's possible to kind of subdivide that into 19th century and early modern philosophy, and some historians do that, some philosophers do that, and it's a fine thing to do. But in this course, we're going to be putting them all together. Maybe in subsequent courses, we'll have like a special course on just Descartes or just 19th century philosophy. But in this course, we're going to be looking at really all as sort of one kind of group. When you're thinking about any historical period, right? So we're thinking about philosophy from 1600 to 1900. There are a couple of things you need to have in mind. One is that I think the central thing you need to have in mind is what I would call the unity and diversity of philosophical experience, right? Or philosophical reasoning. The Etienne Gilson, I'm kind of riffing on Etienne Gilson, who had a nice book called The Unity of Philosophical Experience. Well done. But philosophy in a way is always the same and always changing, right?
Yeah.
It's always has the same aspiration, right? We're looking for first causes. We're looking for first principles. We're trying to reach the most universal explanations and the most foundational ideas that we can. But that's going to look a little different. If you're a 13th century Dominican, or if you're a 5th century BC Athenian, or if you're a 19th century German, right?
Yeah.
That's gonna, obviously it's gonna look different, right? I mean, as much as philosophy aspires to the eternal and the unchanging, that is the heart of philosophical inquiry. At the same time, it's not done by those who are eternal and permanent, right? Philosophy is done by flesh and blood human beings, right?
Yeah.
Who are working in a particular space, a particular time, and so it's important, right, to look at their excuse me, their historical context. Like what's going on in the world around Descartes, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why
Yeah.
is that helps us to think about um, why is he doing what he's doing, right?
Yeah.
What's the agenda of, and I don't mean agenda in like a suspicious way. I just mean like what's he up to? What's he aiming for
Sure.
in his philosophical inquiry? And I think different. It's helpful to think that way. It's also helpful to realize that different historical periods emphasize different problems and challenges.
Yeah.
One of the
Absolutely.
things you notice, yeah, right, about say a lot of medieval philosophy is there's just not a lot of radical skepticism out there. Like radical skepticism is just not kind of a big issue in medieval philosophy, right?
Yeah.
And there's good historical reasons for that, good conceptual reasons as well. Radical skepticism does become a problem in modern philosophy. It becomes a central question. And it's not, you could just say, well, gosh, those people had really weird ideas. Why did they, but why did they think about it? But it's not as if somebody just woke up one day and said, I'm going to be a radical skeptic. Right? There's reasons, there's historical things that bring them, that make the question of knowledge, right,
Yeah. Yeah.
a central concern, right? And so you might think, why is the question of knowledge, why is the question of truth a central concern for modern man? Whereas for medieval man, it wasn't, right? I think
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. Yeah.
important. Even in the ancient world, you have some skepticism, but not anything like in the modern period. Again, so why in the ancient world was skepticism not a radical concern, right?
Yeah, there were
So,
many things that they kind of all agreed upon. It wasn't them going back and saying, "Okay, let's try to figure out a new theory of knowledge," or how
right,
do I,
right, right, right.
how do I even go about thinking? You know,
Mm-hmm.
much of ancient philosophers were just thinking.
Sure. I mean, even in my epistemology class, I kind of struggled with this a little bit. I talked about it in the class that we can talk about philosophy of knowledge, right? Which is where you're sort of giving accounts of how knowledge is formed.
Yeah,
And that's really how St. Thomas develops it. St. Thomas doesn't spend hardly any time defending the reality of knowledge, right?
yeah,
It's just not a question for him. It's not a major question, anyways, right? Whereas modern epistemology is all about that, right? So once you recognize, right, that there are historical circumstances in which philosophers operate,
hmm,
bring up particular ideas, right, or bring up particular problems, then you can start to focus on, well, what are the central themes or ideas of the philosophers working in that period, right?
yeah.
Does that make sense? So you look at the circumstances, what differentiates this period from another, then that helps you to isolate the central problems and questions along with the central ideas and answers to those questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why, and this is sometimes what makes, I think, studying philosophy so difficult for
Mm.
just the armchair philosopher, is that it's difficult to wrap your mind around just the ideas that they are trying to present. Like if you've ever read, Immanuel Kant, you've just,
Oh my, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Can't
you
read
can't do it without drinking. And but then to also understand the the historical context, the
Sure.
historical
Right.
background, when you bring all of that in there, it's so much to just to juggle in your head
Mm,
that I think, um uh when you go through a time period like this, you have to have a good guide. You have to have
mm, mm.
uh some basic historical context, some basic things before you get
Sure.
into, some of those um, odd theories.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it
Those
just
things.
you're right. It's difficult, but it's so important. And the
Yes.
reason
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Yeah.
important is that again, Etienne Gilson does a wonderful job of explaining this. The history of philosophy is like the laboratory of philosophers, right? Right. It's where you see the experiments take place,
Yeah.
like, and in that way, it's really inductively very instructive, right? So you're looking, what is the experience of philosophers? You look at that great diversity of philosophy and philosophers. Some people find that aggravating, that there's so many different approaches. And I understand that. But at the same time, it's also very helpful. Like, I can look at Heraclitus, I can think about, well, what if I thought everything was change and I thought nothing was permanent, right?
Yeah.
Well, there was a guy who thought that way, right? And you can try to understand, and you can kind of look at his work and see how it develops. What if I thought everything was one thing? Well, then I could read Parmenides, right? Instead of thinking that everything, there were different kinds of things, right? So anyways, I mean, I think, what if I tried to combine faith and reason, right? Oh, well, I could look at the great medieval philosophers. I could look at St. Augustine,
Yeah.
St. Anselm, St. Thomas Aquinas. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And to also realize that, even though these, especially when you're looking at modern philosophy, even though these people, may have been misguided,
Mm.
they weren't stupid.
No.
They put
Right.
tremendous thought and trying to organize their theory of knowledge or whatever it is their task was, that they really put a lot of thought into it. And especially for modern philosophy, because it influences our modern culture so much.
Sure.
It's even more important for us to get into this. So maybe you can tell us, what were some of the historical things happening that led to some of these ideas?
Yeah. So this, requires, one of the things that history requires is imagination. And I think it's interesting. I don't remember who said it. I wish I did, but one of the things that an undergraduate. I was both a history major and a philosophy major, but I love both forms of study and learning. And one of the things I heard that was very helpful is to think about history as visiting a foreign country. History, in a way, has some things that we'll recognize, some familiarity to it. We're not talking about space aliens, right?
Sure.
We're talking about human beings. But at the same time, we're talking about human beings from a different period, right? And that operate in different historical circumstances. Jason, can you imagine what it would be like to live in a time when nobody went faster than a sail ship, right? A horse, or maybe a very rare locomotive?
Yeah,
Train, right?
it's hard to even imagine a time without like my cell phone, and that's
Right.
much less technology as a whole. Yeah.
Right. So you have to really kind of use your imagination. You have
Yeah.
to kind of try to kind of step away from your own circumstances a little bit, right? Just a little bit, and try to imagine other times. So what are the major things here? Well, without a doubt, the number one thing I think for the modern, like what distinguishes modernity from the medieval world, right? Now, where you draw the line is always a little fuzzy. There's always a little overlap. That's fine. But we can still say, look, 1750 looks a lot different than 1450, right? It's a whole different thought world, okay? And the biggest thing by far is the scientific revolution. Certainly there was rational, inquiry before the modern period. Good historians trace the beginnings of the scientific method into the late Middle Ages. There's been a lot of good work on that. It's not like the scientific method just dropped out of space into Galileo's head, right? It was, the culmination of a long development within actually medieval philosophy. But nevertheless, we can say that the scientific thinking, especially as expressed and developed by Francis Bacon and Galileo, really was a different way of thinking, right? And I think probably the most important element there's two important elements. One is an attitude and another is a method. So I'll deal with the attitude first. And this is out very clearly in Francis Bacon. For medieval man, the highest developments and uses of reason were contemplative. The point of argument, the point of philosophy, right, was ultimately contemplation, right? The
Yeah.
contemplation of God, the contemplation of nature, um, of the development of wisdom. It had a contemplative aspect, right?
Sure.
I look at the little painting back behind you of Our Lady, and she has a very contemplative look on her face, right?
Yeah.
There's a
Yeah. Yeah.
wonderful picture of Saint Dominic sitting at the foot of the cross, and he's sort of, I think he has his hand, like his, you've probably seen it, right? He has his hand on his like
Yeah. Yeah.
cheek or
Yeah.
something like that. And he's kind of looking, up to that. It's a very contemplative look. That was it's by Fra Angelico, the one I'm talking about. That was the ideal of medieval man. Was
Right.
It was contemplation, reason as leading to contemplation. That's a very different view, right? A very different attitude about reason from the modern setting. Because really, in a way, one thing that's really interesting is contemplation is kind of useless, right?
Yeah.
It's only for its own sake,
It
right?
has no use.
That's right. Yeah, right. It's and mainly because it's so valuable that it doesn't need some further use, right?
Right.
But
What a novel thought.
no, there's a book about that. It's called "Leisure is the Basis of Culture." But anyway, uh, but that's the medieval ideal. In the um, modern ideal is that reason is about the mastery of nature,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
domination of nature, creating technology. Francis Bacon says that will literally allow us to reestablish the Garden of Eden on Earth,
Yep.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's these earphones, it's this microphone, it's our cars, it's our medicine, right? I mean, right now we're looking for something that will keep us from dying from any disease at all, right? Like we have this belief, right,
Yeah.
that we can destroy all disease, all pestilence, right? That is a very modern way to think about reason, right? Reason is about, and science, right,
Yeah.
is about domination. It's
Yeah.
about
So where does
power.
where does friendship come into play here? Right. Like
I don't
that's
know.
yeah. That's a maddening thing that I think that people don't always realize is that there
Mhm.
was a big shift
Yeah,
and
yeah,
and
mhm,
and kind of the object of philosophical inquiry or
yeah,
the use of our abilities or even which I think again goes back to why are we here.
mhm, mhm.
If this
Sure,
is to
sure.
where our knowledge is, that's a big part of who we are. So if this is where if our knowledge is only aimed at progress, comrade, well then that has a weird anthropology attached to it.
Mhm,
uh
mhm.
um
Sure.
yeah, so it's
Yeah.
absolutely fascinating. So then so you have so with the scientific method,
Mhm,
it was kind of thrusting then that knowledge and our ability to reason is for the progress of the human mind to conquer
mhm.
nature then.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. So the conquest of nature, if you look at any standard intellectual history of ideas kind of about this time, that's one of the things that they'll emphasize, right? It's that medieval and ancient man wanted to reflect nature.
Yeah.
Modern man wanted to conquer it, right? The second important point here in terms of science and the changes in reason uh, uh, has to do with the idea of getting rid of final causes.
Mm,
So scientific reasoning does not avail itself of final causality. So you would remember just quickly here from Aristotle, there are four causes. One of the four causes is the final cause, which is about purpose. So one
yeah.
of the ways we understand things is by thinking about, well, what is the purpose of the thing? What is its specific function,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what is, if you want to understand the eye, then you understand it through the role that all the different parts of the eye play in seeing, right? The
Yeah.
final cause of the eye is to see.
See.
And then we can understand, right, the structure of the eye and the optic nerve through that purpose, right? Scientific reasoning dismissed both final causality and formal causality, and focuses simply on material causality and efficient causality. What happens, how often, when, and what is it made out of?
and and I
That's
think
that's what scientific. That's like modern science is interested. It's not interested really in definitions based on form and structure.
Yeah.
And it's not based, and it's not interested in thinking about purpose.
Yeah, and I think that's huge. Not to say that those things are unimportant,
Hmm.
but that we can't forget those formal and final causes.
Hmm.
Because, and I'll point our audience, go look this up. If you look in the, I think it was a year ago, probably now. I know I've mentioned it before, but if you go look in the UK, they established a ministry of loneliness
Right, right. Hmm.
because it said 9 out of 10 Brits
Hmm.
saw no ultimate purpose to life.
Yeah, sure,
That
sure.
is what happens when you reduce all knowledge and your entire theory of knowledge stops
Hmm.
asking the question about final cause, and it says only the
Yeah,
only knowledge is that which is available to sensory experience.
yeah, that's
And we
right.
can't
Yeah.
really don't want
Hmm.
to go we don't want to really think about it. We can't really think about it with any
Sure.
certainty after that. That's what happens. So
Hmm.
just what
Yeah,
do you want to
that's
go to?
it. Just that's really great. And I think, just to kind of make it a little more even, put it in simpler terms. When we're talking about this, we're talking about the purpose and meaning of something, right?
Yeah,
So that purpose and meaning drop out of analysis, right? They drop out of objective inquiry, scientific inquiry. Now, let me just quickly add,
sure.
I don't think that this is necessarily in itself a bad thing.
Hmm.
The way you want to think about this is that modern scientific method that focuses explicitly just on quantity and quantification, observation, experimentation, those sorts of things. It's valuable almost precisely because uh, involves simplifying assumptions, right?
Yeah,
The early scientists didn't deny necessarily the reality of final causality. They didn't
right.
deny the reality of formal causes, but they said that we want to study this without paying attention to them, right?
Mm,
And again, not because they don't exist, but because it allows you to kind of simplify your analysis
yeah,
and focus in on particular things like how often does this happen? How
yeah.
fast does it happen? Notice these are all quantity type words, right? And that makes some sense, to investigate things in that manner. Does that make sense,
Yeah,
Jason?
yeah, absolutely. And I think, what the it is a noble cause to say we want to be able to study something in an orderly fashion, and we
Hmm.
want to
Hmm.
put together an orderly way to present it to people so that they can understand what's going on in the natural
Hmm.
world and things
Hmm.
like that.
Hmm.
And again, to emphasize maybe on these other causes,
Hmm.
that's I think that's good and noble, and I mean I think that's what
Sure.
God wants us to do with our
Sure.
minds, with our reasons.
Hmm. And,
But
and and as we found out, it's very effective.
yeah, yeah, it's very
I mean,
effective in making sense of the world.
hmm. Hmm.
That's a huge part of it.
I think, yeah,
Um,
it's very effective, especially in making things, right?
yeah,
And making better. This is gonna sound weird, but this is part of the modern project. Making better sailing ships, better artillery, better forms of machinery, right? It's very good at techne, right?
yeah,
Creating instruments, right? Um, um, yeah, so,
yeah. I'm very thankful for my glasses. I can see
exactly. Yeah,
better.
yeah, sure, yeah, yeah,
Technology is good.
yeah, yeah.
Well, yeah,
Yeah. It's it's fine.
it's fine.
It depends on how you use it,
It
right?
works
That's right.
exactly.
But that's it. It works. See, that's the thing is science was amazing in like making the simplifying assumptions,
Yeah,
employing this method, right? It created amazing results, right, in terms of the power of modern man,
hmm,
right? Um, and that's it's something you just really can't overlook, right? In terms of
absolutely.
its in terms of our ability to build buildings, our abilities to create trains, our abilities to predict the currents, our abilities to sail. It's amazing. Actually, I mean, you go from everything that was developed out of that modern period. You can see why, I think, when you see all these amazing changes that were brought in through the scientific method, why modern man had such a profound faith in reason and science.
Yeah,
They were, I mean, it's hard for us to think about this, but they were so excited about it, right? I mean, this was like people were like, wow, what's going to be next, right?
Yeah.
What's the newest? Like, there's going to, like, we are conquering nature, right? We're overcoming all these problems that's, have existed, for centuries in the past. So along with sort of an enthusiasm for science, right, and a different method, right, we also have the decline of religious authority. Now, it's very important to say, recognize here, most modern men were not atheists or agnostics. It would be very, very silly to think that. If you went, if you were in Oxford and you went to the local pub, you're not going to run into a bunch of agnostics and atheists. Okay, there was a small segment of society, sometimes called the philosophes, right, in France, and then they had their imitators in other parts of Europe, that did entertain agnostic and atheistic ideas, right?
Sure.
But it would be a misconception to think that modern countries were as a whole, agnostic or atheistic, right? The leading intellectuals sometimes were. But not all by any stretch. Now, why the decline of religious authority? Well, because we're in a post-Reformation, post-Wars of Religion Europe, right?
Right.
And so basically the idea that there is one obvious truth about religion, right, has gone away, right? Protestantism and Catholicism have gone their separate ways. Different forms of Protestantism have gone their separate ways. We've had long wars of religion in France. And, there was eventually a kind of a draw, essentially, also in Germany. So the idea that there's orthodoxy, right? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Certainly like an Anglican thinks that there's orthodoxy, a Catholic thinks that there's orthodoxy, there's a Lutheran that thinks there's orthodoxy, but there's no one orthodoxy, right? There's competing orthodoxies. And that tends to diminish, right, your recourse to religious explanations and to religious tenets. Now, again, religion plays an important role throughout the modern period, and it would be wrong-headed to think otherwise. But it doesn't play as much of a role, right? It doesn't have that sort of culture-forming force that it did in medieval period, right? It's there for sure. It's in the mix, but it's no longer supreme, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. The idea sometimes we may have in our head is this illustrious, Christendom that lived and worked with that. Not so in the modern period. It wasn't this force that it had been. It wasn't this, and even So I mean, even the people's trust of the church of these things just kind of waned.
Diminishes.
So with the decline of say religious authority and this uptick in our ability to reason and the possibilities, the possibilities of reasoning scientifically exploded.
So it sets the stage, right, for a different way of thinking, right? See, I don't have to think under the church. I don't have to think under the Bible, right, like a medieval man would have done, or even say like someone like Luther would have thought of himself as working within the Bible. Whether he was right or wrong is another question, but that's the way he would have thought of thinking, if that makes sense, right? Also, we have now a new paradigm for thinking, right? The scientific revolution, right? So all of a sudden, see, philosophy is becoming different. It's no longer the handmaiden of theology. In addition to that, we have a new model for reasoning, which is science, right? The third thing that's important here is really the development of the middle class and its aspirations for self-governance. This is a really complicated topic. I don't want to go into it too much, but you think about medieval society. Medieval society is a society of patronage and privilege, custom, right? And the main way you advance is through patronage, right? But mostly you don't advance. That's the important part, right? Like medieval society is about stability, right? If you're, Jason, let's say that your father was a serf. Do you know what you would be, Jason?
A serf, always.
There you go.
And all my children, my grandchildren.
That's right. So, and the same thing if your father was a cobbler, you're going to be a cobbler. I hope you like cobbling. So, I mean, but that starts to change with the rise of of a middle class that's not dependent upon the aristocracy and is not dependent upon the church, right? They have a sense of economic independence, right?
Yeah.
That they're self-reliant, that they are going to make it on their own. So we're talking about everything from middle-sized farmers, small farmers, but still with the note of independence, to artisans and merchants, right? These folks are folks who kind of they're outside of, right, the feudal system, right? They're living kind of on their own in a sense, at least to a degree that hadn't been beforehand.
Yeah. That's the key. Yeah.
And so they have economic independence. Well, what do they want? What are such people going to say? Oh, well, yeah, I mean, I shouldn't have any say in how things are run politically.
No, they're going to say, I want my thinking, and I want my thinking independent of all other coercions. Right?
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. So I'm economically independent. Why shouldn't I be politically independent? Right.
Yeah.
And so we have then the rise of an aspiration for freedom and liberty, I think, that was just unknown to medieval man. Yeah. There was a sense of self-governance, kind of a moderate sense of freedom in the medieval period, but really unequal in its application, if you're honest. Right? Yeah. And so the idea of sort of being fully independent is really kind of a modern idea, right? So you have these three things then together, right? You have the rise of the scientific method, right, which gives you a new way of a new model for reasoning. You have, in addition to that, right, the decline of religious authority, which means that you're no longer, there's an autonomy to reason, right? Right. Reason can just function on its own. It can function on its own without reference to religious authority and without reference to tradition, right? Or custom, or even final causality, right? So it has this new sort of almost kind of, when they built, like in the French Revolution, when they built this statue, right, to reason, right, to the goddess reason, they kind of weren't kidding around, right? Like they really believed that reason had this amazing force and power and independence to it. And that went right along with the idea of political independence. Do you see how all those things kind of mesh together in an interesting way?
Oh yeah, it sounds like a very exciting time.
I think it was
outside of like plagues and stuff. Like it seems like a very exciting time. And again, some of these things that you're talking about, we just kind of take for granted.
Sure.
But the novelty of them at that time, I think really opened up man to to many new ideas, and not just new ideas, but new ways of thinking that I don't have to take into account. And I think when you say, maybe you can clarify, when you say like I don't have to listen to church authority, for them it wasn't so much like I need to submit my paper to the Vatican for approval, but that I can ignore all religious thought together.
Not only can I ignore it, Jason, what I really need to do is I need to reform religion through the lens of reason. Yeah. So this is one of the things that drives me absolutely up the wall when some people start talking about the idea that St. Thomas Aquinas is a rationalist. I think if you say that, I really think you're just ignorant, to be honest. If you want to find a rationalist, look at Thomas Jefferson, okay? Thomas Jefferson is a rationalist, right? He takes the Bible and the New Testament and eliminates all those parts that are strictly supernatural and leaves only the ethical parts. Why is that? Because his reason says that supernatural things are superstitious and impossible, and therefore should be eliminated from the New Testament. That's a rationalist. St. Thomas was not a rationalist, okay? But anyways, if I seem exercised about
Thank you for that clarification.
I've heard it so many times, it drives up the wall. But anyways, St. Thomas defends the reality of miracles. This sounds maybe prosaic to us, but it was a huge part of early modern culture
Hmm.
It's not as if people immediately jump to atheism.
Yeah.
Most of them jump to deism, right? And to religious rationalism. So they would say there's a God,
Yeah.
and that, kind of a watchmaker
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
God that kind of set things in order and then kind of got them going and then leaves it alone. And man studies what happens in the clock or in the watch using the scientific method. We need to eliminate superstition, that sort
Hmm.
of thing, right? Jesus is a great moral teacher, etc. Right? Um, so that was the real option. Most people didn't become atheists. In the 19th century, you get some atheists, genuine atheism. Most people became deists, but it did mean that they could reject religious authority.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was kind of like this, the when the scientific revolution happened and we have this era of modern philosophy that it's now the adulthood of humanity.
Very good.
we've
Yeah,
we've
yeah,
we've
yeah.
lived through that childhood
Mm,
experience where we've put those things that we can't explain
mm,
onto the shoulders of God and his thing. but
mm.
now but now now we really understand that God is letting us loose as adults, and we can
That's
think
right.
freely and
Yeah,
act
yeah.
freely and
That's right.
and
That's really great,
certainly
Jason.
become it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I want to add to that. The Especially say reaching the adulthood of man, right?
Yeah.
So one of the best little essays, if you want to read a kind of primary text source uh, that sort of expresses the enthusiasm of that time, is just a little short. It's a really short essay by Immanuel Kant called "What Is Enlightenment."
Hmm.
I'll just want to note for the readers, for the listeners, that um, Kant's essays are actually very easy to read.
Yeah.
His critiques are nearly impossible, right? But his essays, and this is an essay, it was actually very nicely written. So
Yeah.
you can understand it quite clearly. And he says just what you're saying there, Jason, that enlightenment is man coming to think for himself,
Yeah.
throwing off the tutelage, right? That is the mastery of our former protectors and patrons, right? Religion
Yeah.
is exactly what he means. And coming to think for ourselves, right? And he says, at the very end, he ends with this very kind of this enthusiastic enlightenment motto: dare to think,
Dare
right?
to think.
you
Yeah.
know, and think for yourself, right? Now, this is so
That sounds like
interesting.
a great idea, Dr. Smith. We should. But what does Kant really really mean by that?
Well, he means, of course, to think for ourselves. And I think the problem with that is you're you might be wrong, okay, and you might actually be stupid, and you might make a lot of really dumb mistakes. And wouldn't it be better to rely on those who might be wiser than you, right?
Yeah, yeah.
To some degree.
Yeah, I think a quick kind of intellectual activity here can help us understand this. Would you tell your doctor, you know what, all that schooling you had in grad school and
Yeah,
medicine school, forget that. Think
yeah.
for yourself.
I'm thinking for
No.
myself, Doc. Right?
Like, no, please do not think for yourself.
That's right. Yeah, and you think I mean, it's a good illustration, I think, of certainly it meant stepping away from religious authority.
Yeah.
Uh, he also thinks and says quite clearly that he calls in other places. He talks about breaking free of the apron strings of Mother Nature,
Ooh, that's
and
cute. That's
yeah,
cute.
he's like, we don't need to be led by nature. We don't
Yeah.
need to conform to nature. Nature needs to conform to us,
Us. Yeah.
right? Again, very modern Enlightenment kind of ideal. You think how different that is than medieval thinking. Just as a matter of comparison, medieval man loves precedent,
Yeah.
right? He wants to know, what did Cicero think, and what did Boethius think, and what did you see, like there's this sense of, I want to be within this long tradition, and I want to
Yeah.
think within that long tradition, and that's how you become educated. That's how you become wise, is by embedding yourself within this long intellectual tradition. Modern man has no interest in that, right?
Yeah, so Kant, when he says dare to think or think for yourself, he's not saying that we should that somehow we should just not rely on those authorities, that we should just kind of think, we should think deeply through these things and listen to he's saying, like, there needs to be kind of a break
That's right.
here. and what has gone before us.
Mhm.
We need to put away those childish things
Mhm.
of antiquity, and we need to begin again.
There needs to be an originality, a spontaneity, an independence, right,
Yeah,
of
and
thinking,
that
right?
autonomy you were talking about
That's
is
right, yeah.
huge. Yeah.
Which again is so different because the modern medieval man, but you can actually find this in other ancient cultures, um, say a Confucian kind of culture as well. But the idea that the way you become wise is by submitting to a tradition,
Yeah.
right, and then working within it. Whereas for modern man, no, and this is it's not the case at all. It needs to be totally independent. This goes along, but this comes out in the idea that every modern philosopher says, almost every modern philosopher is like, all other philosophers have gotten it wrong, and now it's my turn to start everything over again. It's so funny, like Locke, Hume, Descartes,
Yeah.
Leibniz, Spinoza,
The
Kant.
audacity,
They're
right?
all like that. They're all like, well, everybody's got it wrong. Now I'm going to start philosophy over again. Many ancient medieval guys didn't think that way, right?
Yeah.
They would say, look, there's an error here or there. There's problems, and but there's also a lot of good stuff, and so we have to kind of develop within that tradition, right?
Yeah.
Modern guys want to start all over with everything. You see that, I think, in the philosophical context, right? So thinking for yourself.
Hmm.
Uh, but you also see it to some degree in the political context. And that's one of the things in this course I
Yeah.
really want to emphasize is the connections between these things.
Hmm.
There's a tendency sometimes in a modern philosophy class to emphasize only questions of knowledge.
Right.
And there's good reasons for that, right? But modern man wasn't an epistemologist, right? He was modern man is a citizen, right?
Yeah.
As well, and all these things for modern people were tied together. One of the things that kind of redirected a little bit of my interest in modern philosophy in this area was realizing that people were just, I know it's going to be hard to believe, Jason, but people were genuinely thrilled and in ecstasy over the work of Immanuel Kant. And you're like, what? Like, if you read Kant, it's like so hard and dry, right? Like, why is it? Why would reading the Critique of Pure Reason, right, cause people to have such crazy enthusiasm, right?
Yeah.
Um, I think right, one of the things you have to realize is they saw cultural and political implications it's hard for us
Yeah.
to pick up on,
Yeah.
right? Coming from a 21st century perspective, looking back at Kant, Kant saying things that to us seem just kind of dry logical points about theory of knowledge,
Yeah.
but that in reality had profound implications for ethics, politics, and culture. I don't want to go into all of it right now, but I'll just say this: Kant, he said, as he says, freed man from the tyranny of metaphysics. That's the way he was seen in his time, right? Is that he liberated human beings, right, from being dominated by ideas about reality, right?
And if you're a Thomist, you can pick yourself up off the floor right now. And and I think that's because that's one thing that many people are saying today, especially within the church, is that we need to really teach metaphysics again. We need to go. We
Yeah,
need to
sure.
to recover, particularly a Thomistic metaphysics. We need to recover this in order to recover some of the Catholic thinking today and the way that we apply it and things like that. But I think that's one of the most important keys to understanding this time period as well,
Right.
is kind of that the not just ignoring of metaphysics, but like almost a seeking out to destroy
Yeah, yeah.
metaphysics.
Yeah, you really sort of either, especially once you get into the Kant and post-Kantian periods, an overcoming of metaphysics or a sort of radical transformation of it into ways that would have been unrecognizable to ancient or medieval man, and really sort of outside the bounds of common sense even. Um, but had important cultural and political implications. We, basically on the basis of Kant, we can't know anything about the thing in itself.
Right.
We can't know anything about the forms of things, the purposes of things in themselves. We can't know the existence of God. We can't know the immortality of the soul, etc. Right? Your culture changes when people stop thinking that way or start thinking
Absolutely.
that way, right?
Yeah.
Man before medieval man, European man before this thinks there's purposes in nature. We can know there's purposes and value and meaning in nature, and we can know it. And there's a God above that orders the world, and who's the ultimate end, and etc. Right? Interestingly, like the Reformation didn't change that, right?
Right.
Reformation people, Protestants thought that way as the Catholics. What changed that was the Enlightenment, right? And Kant liberates all of culture, right, from that worldview and puts it in a worldview where man is deeply, truly, and radically autonomous, right? He
Yeah.
is really a law unto himself. And that caused people to be really excited, particularly upper middle class to middle class young people, right? The
Sounds so familiar.
if you're a peasant, you're like, I don't know, there's a nature, right? But if you're kind of an upper middle class to middle class person, especially if your father has some aspirations to aristocratic culture,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Then he might even just say, pay, like, find a living for you or pay for you to act like a gentleman, to dress like a gentleman, to not have too much work to do, or maybe you work as a clerk in an office or something like that, right? But these sorts of people were very excited about this, right?
Yeah.
Because it meant that a lot of the cultural hierarchy
Yeah.
and customs were going to change, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot more things are going to be free and open and available to people that were not beforehand. We're not available
Now,
beforehand.
were there any, so, we kind of cast those into in a negative light.
Mhm.
Is there any positive things that came out of
Mhm.
the Enlightenment or
Sure.
modern philosophy?
I think, yes, to be sure, I think definitely some things come out of it that are um, important, and I think,
Important.
yeah, but also valuable.
Yeah.
I think obviously the an appreciation for um, the value and efficacy of science,
Yeah.
thinking about science. Now, probably what needed to be done more of was thinking about the limits of science. Okay,
Mm,
at the time,
yeah.
but at the same time, I think this idea of a new method of inquiry, a
Sure.
method that involved experimentation and emphasized experience more, right, than some other things, was probably good. I think with a lot of these, there's a balance here. I would
Yeah.
say an excessive an excessive reliance on custom can stultify thinking,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
Um, I think that there are, in the various global cultures, there are examples of this,
Hmm.
right? Um, but I think again, the Enlightenment tended to underplay probably the value of custom, if that
Yeah.
makes sense,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I think there's a way in which it kind of is a little bit healthy to be able to at least step away from custom a little bit
Sure.
and tradition when you're, especially as a philosopher, right? Um, at the same time, I think they went too far. you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and I think you could see that even with, like, countries that are, say, culturally Catholic. Many
mhm,
times, if religion is so built into the culture, it's quite easily, or it's easy to go through life without really
mhm,
thinking about it that much. So
mhm.
when there sometimes, when there is a force that is uh, um, against your religion or something like that, it does require you to enter into, thinking deeply about it in that way.
Sure, sure.
But at the same time,
Yeah, right.
to completely
To go,
just,
yeah.
yeah.
I think that another area where you can see a lot of values. There's probably an elitism built into
Mm,
ancient medieval thought that needed to be improved upon. And by elitism, I don't. Obviously, it's the case. I'm just going to say that some people are smarter than others,
yeah.
um, but that obvious truth led people like Plato and then everyone he influenced, which is everyone, uh, to um, to think, well, the wise are very few,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And I think that probably underestimated the cognitive capacities of that are common to man. Does that make
Hmm.
sense?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
I think more people are capable of thinking deeply than the ancient medieval philosophers and theologians thought.
Yeah.
So I think that, that's an improvement. And the last one I'll just mention is I think that we can see some real improvement in terms of um, self-critical a self-critical stance
Okay.
in modern thinking. It's not as if this did not exist beforehand,
Hmm.
but modern philosophers really plumbed in sort of the depths in trying to figure reason itself out, right?
Yeah.
So I think that there's a lot in the Aristotelian Thomist tradition, especially in its rational psychology,
Hmm.
that tries to kind of figure out knowledge and reason. But modern philosophers really tried to get at like why reason, right? Why should we trust reason? Not just how does it work, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But how do we know it's true, right? And most of these people who were doing this were not radical skeptics. They weren't asking this question because they wanted to undermine reason.
Yeah.
They were trying to find, in a sort of self-critical way, and
Sure.
also in a autonomous way, an account of reason that allowed reason to have indubitable foundations, as Descartes would put it, right? And I think that project went astray, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
But it's also valuable to be self-aware,
Yeah.
right? And to be self-critical in terms of thinking about your reasoning. And so I
Yeah.
think that is a positive contribution, right? What are the real grounds of why I think this way?
Yeah. Yeah. It wasn't. It
Um,
wasn't skepticism for the purpose of destroying the things you didn't agree
no,
with.
no,
It
yeah,
was
no, no.
skepticism. And am I, why am I saying what I'm saying?
Hmm.
Why do I
Hmm.
believe what I believe?
Hmm.
That's a healthy skepticism. It's not
Sure.
the hermeneutic of skepticism that our current culture just
Labors
begins with.
under, right?
Gosh.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I know we're gone long here. Do I have just
Yeah.
how
Yeah. A
much
few
time do I
minutes.
have here?
Yeah. Yeah.
A few minutes here. Okay, so I think those are the contributions
Sure.
of modern philosophy. The last one I would add is just a greater appreciation for liberty. Um, I think medieval and ancient man had an appreciation for self-governance, but
Yeah.
very limited and very unequally applied.
Hmm.
I think again the modern period went too far in the other
Yeah.
direction. As I like to say about human beings, after we run off one cliff for a while, we realize, oh, we're running off a cliff, and so we turn around and run off another
There's a
cliff.
whole nother cliff over here.
We
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
run off. So I think they went too far, right,
Sure.
in
Yeah.
the liberty, but then probably needed an expansion of self-governance.
Yeah.
Like I said, I mean, if your dad was a serf, you're going to be a serf, and your kids are going to be a serf, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah.
But in any event, the problems, though, I'm just going to give two
Sure.
in general things. One is with reason itself, and then two is with politics and culture. Um, Reason, what we actually found out. So modern philosophy is like a laboratory, right?
Yeah.
Like medieval philosophy was, like ancient philosophy was. What we found out is a reason that wants to justify itself in its own terms without recourse to anything else ends up being self-defeating.
Yeah.
It ends
Absolutely.
up eating itself, right? Um, uh, that we need reason, as wonderful as it is, right, needs the contributions of theology and tradition and common sense.
Hmm.
Without those, right, we find reason just eats itself up.
Yeah.
It's remarkable watching modern philosophy, and you'll see this in the course. Brilliant insights, amazing thoughts and
Hmm.
theories, and devastating critiques of the modern philosopher who came right before them, right? And they just destroy themselves, right? Basically, at the end of it, it really, the course, is going to end with Friedrich Nietzsche, who I think is a profound thinker in certain ways. Obviously, a thinker much at odds with Catholic faith and right reason, I would say, but nevertheless profound. And he really kind of he shows the emperor has no clothes, right? At the end of the day, right? That enlightenment and reason at the end of the day just went too far and destroyed itself.
Yeah, he's the primary saint of the modern philosophical period.
He kind of like shows, hey, like this isn't what you guys think, right? So I think that's one of the problems, is that reason, unfettered reason, right, ends up destroying itself. The other is,
look at the French Revolution, right?
Yeah. Sure, right. The French, yeah, sure. We start with liberty and equality. We end up cutting off the heads of everybody who can. Right? Some people are more equal than others, right? Or the other is on the lines of politics and culture. I'm sympathetic to the aspirations for greater self-governance in modern thought. At the same time, what really happened is the idea that got emphasized of liberty and equality trumped the good, right? Whereas genuine self-governance, right, involves a responsible and prudent decision-making in the light of the good, right? So that we're pursuing the good, but there's different ways to pursue the good. There's different means to pursue the good. And that's self-governance, right? Self-governance is deciding for yourself how to pursue the good.
The good, right?
That drops out, now, again, I don't want to overstate it, not entirely, not to the same degree in every thinker, right? I think, if you'd asked the founding fathers of America, right, say the United States of America, right, which is a very modern place, right? I mean, it's founded by thinkers and politicians inspired in part by these ideas. Not only these ideas, sometimes Catholics exaggerate that, I think, but in part by these ideas. And, they would have thought, of course, self-governance is for religious people. It's for virtuous people that are going to be pursuing the good. And they wouldn't have imagined, the kinds of libertine behavior that gets justified today in the name of liberty, right? So I want to make that qualification. But there was a sense that we can define and value freedom without bringing the good into view, right?
Yeah.
And that's a profound error.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And so this autonomy is not just because that's at face value, that sounds good. I have this autonomy to seek out to achieve the good that I see. But this autonomy went wrong when it said I get to determine, and everybody else gets to determine also what is good for themselves.
That's right.
So this autonomy becomes elevated above what is actually good. And again, you can see the importance of metaphysics here, I think.
Sure.
Of determining what is good for the person.
Yeah. And I think really the word autonomy is what's key here.
Yeah.
The autonomy literally means law unto oneself. Right?
Yeah.
Medieval man, classical man did not think that way, right?
Yeah.
And I think even the best of the Enlightenment didn't entirely think that way, right?
Sure.
But I think, there was a tendency in this direction, right, of a law unto yourself. You'll probably notice, although I use the terms freedom and liberty occasionally, I prefer the term self-governance because I think it kind of brings into view the idea that there is a law, there is a good. I'm going to govern myself in view of the good and the law, but I'm not the law, right?
Yeah.
There's a law outside of myself. There's a good outside of myself. Autonomy, strictly construed, makes you the law unto yourself, and so you define the good.
That's awesome. That's it's just again, if you when you kind of get a glimpse of this entire world, you
Hmm.
could really see, I think, how exciting this can be. I mean, and I
Sure.
think this is why it's also very exciting for young people that go to college, because they're experiencing these kind of things for the first time with regards to their physical freedoms. And
Mhm.
so when their intro to philosophy professor tells them to think for themselves,
Yeah.
oh, this sounds so exciting, but we know where it goes, we know where it
Right.
leads, and that's why it's important to have good guides and good philosophy professors as well. um, well, Dr. Smith, you've given us, I think, a lot to think about, and we didn't even get into many of the ideas, the main
Mhm.
ideas that really drove the whole modern philosophical period. But I hope this gives our listeners a good context to begin to think about where these philosophies originated from, and where they were germinated and grew
Mhm.
into full-fledged kind of philosophical assumptions that we live in today. And
Mhm.
so I want to invite all of our listeners, check out all of our material over at Catholic Studies Academy. Check out Dr. Smith's courses, and his,
Subscribe to the course. You'll
yeah,
learn a lot.
yeah. And begin with Intro to Philosophy. He kind of he goes from there. And again, this it's important for us to study these things, to go through them in a systematic way. And of course, I hope we've also illustrated that there's so many things happening with regards to this, and it's important for us to have good guides. And I can attest that Dr. Smith is one of those. So I'm going to invite all the listeners, check out all of our content over at Catholic Studies Academy. Until next time, God bless.